Hey everyone, welcome to the UFOhub live stream. So, as you might have noticed, today's guest is going to be Thomas Fusco. I consider him a great friend of mine, although I haven't seen him in 6 years. No, we met at a conference about 6 years ago, and we just had a great time. And he has a very interesting book out and interesting subject to talk about. So, we're going to definitely get into that. So, first things first, I would like to cover some things. As of today, we are a week out of the Ozark Mountain Virtual Conference. And so you you can still go to the website and let me switch this over for you. You can still go to the website and get the tickets. There's going to be George Norrie, Whitley Strieber, Mary Rodwell, and many others on there. The information is right on the site. You can check it out. When you go to the website, their main website is ozarkufoconference.com. And on the very front page, you'll see a register button. You can simply click on that, and it should take you to this registration page. And the conference is over the weekend, so Saturday and Sunday. And we hope you join us. It's very versatile in the sense that you can share your audio and video to ask the speakers a question, and you can also chat with the people that are watching it with you. So it could be a friend of yours or somebody you don't know very well, but you can at least approach them and say hello. So anyway, that's regarding that. The other part that I wanted to cover is it's about I get emails often from different people that basically they ask me for some kind of promotions, which I don't do, or tell me about their channel and whatnot. And before, I didn't necessarily have a way to give them a shout out. And at the same time, I was kind of hesitant because I wanted to make sure that that I don't endorse somebody who's not exactly aligning with what it is that I'm doing. And I'm still not wanting to do that. But if a channel or a person that has a website or YouTube looks, very reasonable, and they have the information put together so that it can be, consumed by people and read about or watched, I don't mind giving them a shout out. Now, of course, if there's something there that I wasn't aware of before that people say, hey, did you know about this? Why are you promoting that? I'm sorry to say, but I can't, do a deep dive every single time. If anything, take this with just a curiosity of, hey, check this out. If you like it, great. If not, I can't vouch for them. But anyway, so what I'm specifically talking about here is this gentleman, I believe, based on the video, it looks like that he's in Canada, and the channel is called Vast Experience. So check it out. He has some videos that he recorded about UFOs, and they look pretty neat. So again, check it out. I'm not affiliated with him. We're not connected in any way. I just thought it would be something interesting for you guys to see. So again, the channel is Vast Experience, and I hope you find something useful there. Okay. Let's see here. All right. So as always, please keep in mind to use the 3 stars before you ask a question. So that way it pops out easily at me. And so that way I don't have to kind of sift through trying to figure out if you're talking to somebody else in chat or me. All right, let's get this going here. So without any further ado, let's bring in Thomas. Thomas, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great, Adnan. Great to talk to you again.
Awesome. Oh, I'm so sorry, guys. For those of you watching, I forgot to mention, unfortunately, we couldn't do video. So we're having a book and a picture of Thomas out there. So you should be getting him loud and clear. And so I hope you don't mind. I totally slipped my mind to say something about it. But yeah, Thomas. So what I always like to do is just please get into your background. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do.
Well, specifically, I guess it's good to talk about how I did get into this kind of alternative field. Um, Back in my late teens and early 20s, I had several profound, what you might call parapsychological experiences. I don't like to use the word psychic experiences because that term carries a lot of baggage with it, so to speak. But those experiences caused me to call into question the model of reality that I was taught at university. Uh, what it came down to, rather than pursuing anything practitioner or experiential, uh, I chose, or I was stimulated by the intellectual aspect of it, which essentially is a question, how can these things occur? How can supernatural events occur in the universe? What kind of a universe would how is it put together that would cause these kinds of things to happen or allow them to happen? And so that set me on a very long uh, uh, many years of research to come up with a theoretical model uh, that would not only be meaningful scientifically and consistent with scientific findings, but would also provide a framework that would explain a lot of phenomena that that otherwise defied explanation. So when I got that together to an extent that I thought it was ready to let out of the bag, so to speak, I published my work back in 2011. It's called the theory of supergeometry, is what the theoretical theory is, and of course the book is Behind the Cosmic Veil, and we we went forward from there.
So, Thomas, could you maybe go a little bit into some of the subjects so it gives the people an idea what it is that you're talking about, so that maybe later they'll know to follow up on some questions?
Well, yeah, basically, if I could kind of put it in uh, a premise, is that modern physics is based on what we would call materialism, which means that physical reality is confined to the universe, the physical universe. And a physical universe is reality. And there's nothing that exists beyond that. Physics, of course, mainstream physics, the very name physics implies the study of everything that is physical. But it became clear early on in my work that this was insufficient. That in the overview of science, where we talk about cause and effect, that there were more effects that were measurable and observable than what the physical content of the universe could explain. And so, after researching that very thoroughly, the natural conclusion was that reality is more than what is physical. Now, that seems to be a pretty, you know, almost an outworn kind of a statement. But the problem is that there was no theoretical framework by which we could define or even begin to uh, qualify and quantify what that would be. What kind of a superstructure, so to speak, would be overlying physical reality but would be connected to physical reality and part of uh, what physical reality behaves like. And so, supergeometry is a framework by which we can understand phenomena that currently defies conventional explanation, but in a way that is much more exacting and scientifically meaningful than just these broad statements like the spirit realm, or it's another dimension, which are generally terms that indicate that the speaker has no idea what they're talking about. Uh, so this is very specific, and that's basically the foundation of my work. So that's the basic premise, the basic concept.
So, how what would you do? You have then a theory on where then this cause, I guess, is coming from? Because you said there's a
Oh,
cause and
absolutely.
effect, right?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. Um, and it takes I'd like to take a few minutes to give a little bit of a background on that. When we talk about cause and effect in physics, this would be known as causality. That's a term. Oftentimes in science, terms will be used that are also used in general conversation, in the general language. But when they're used scientifically, they can sometimes mean something a little bit different than what we would think about when using it in common conversation. So, for example, uh, all causality in the physical universe, according to the model of the universe that we have, that we can understand, all causes are physically local to the effect. And so, for example, um, well, I talk about it in my book. Excuse me. If you had a piece of paper laying on a table, on a desk, and you picked it up with your hand, the thing that would cause that piece of paper to move is the force of your hand. And the force and your hand would be local to or connected to the paper. That's local causality. That's normal. So, even for example, in a radio broadcast, you could be listening to a radio, but the radio is receiving an electromagnetic wave that has modulations on it, uh, that is coming from a broadcasting station, a tower. So the electromagnetic wave is local to the broadcast tower, and then it's local to the radio because it's physically connected, it's physically in contact with the radio. So here we have local causality. Uh, what makes something supernatural or paranormal, and if I can interject, this was one of the first things, Adnan, that I had to determine in my research was how can we come up with a scientifically meaningful definition for what would be paranormal or supernatural? And that what I came up with is that what makes something paranormal or supernatural is that the effect is non-local. It is not local to any physical cause. And in that way, we got rid of some of um, the paranormal being normally some sort of a catch-all basket and everything weird people put in it. Uh, This is something that is very meaningful uh, scientifically. So, for example, if the piece of paper lifted off the table all by itself, that would be non local causality or non locality, as they say. Um, give you another example. Let's say, for example, if we're talking about the field of paranormal phenomena, uh, if you were in a dark room and you saw the faint image of a person who was standing in there, was standing in the room with you, but it's so dark you can barely see the person based on the reflection of the ambient light off of their body. That would be normal. That would be local causality or locality, as they say, because the ambient light is local to the body and the body is local to the light waves that are reaching your eye and being seen in your retina and all that. Everything's local, it's connected. But if we saw what they call an apparition, which would have the same kind of an appearance, but there's nobody standing there, that's non-locality, because the reflected image that you're seeing as a person is not coming off of a physical person. There is no physical person there. So that's what makes it non-local. Uh, so uh, that's the first piece of critical understanding. The second piece of critical understanding, which is so often overlooked, even by mainstream physics, let alone in the alternative studies like paranormal phenomena, like ufology, is the concept of information. I can't stress how important that is. Um, back, and again, this is a term that is used a little bit different scientifically than it is in common conversation. Uh, for many years, most people, Adnan, they remember being taught in school the mass energy conservation laws. Uh, that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. I think people will remember that till the day they die because that's what they were taught repeatedly in school. But over the last, especially the last couple decades, we also have an extension of that, which is the conservation laws of information. And those laws state that the information from which mass and energy is assembled and designed, the information itself cannot be created nor destroyed. And we don't talk about this concept of information very often, but it's vitally critical. Uh, so, for example, in our instance with seeing the reflection of a real person that kind of looks like an apparition because it's dark, but a person is actually there. We are seeing light waves that are carrying the information about the geometry of that person that we're seeing the faint image of. When we see the apparition, there is no body providing the information. And yet, the information is still manifesting, it's still materializing. So that we see an image of a person when a person isn't there. The information, the idea, the concept of information and the aspect of information is the key, because now we can unlock our thinking and saying, okay, we are seeing a collection of information. We're seeing that information materialize, but there is no physical source in local space that would be the storage house for that information. That information would have to be stored with extreme fidelity so that it can be materialized as a as an image of a person, but it would also have to come from a place where the mechanism by which information could be materialized is at work. So if there's nothing in local space that has that kind of mechanism that can store it, play it back with incredible fidelity, so materialized that the ambient light can actually reflect off of the materialization, then that leads us to an inescapable conclusion is that the information is not being stored locally in the physical universe. The information is coming from outside of the physical and manifesting itself as a materialized collection of data in the universe, in the physical universe. That those two ideas together opens up a whole world. And in the understanding, in the attempt to, in the effort to understand what in the world is going on.
So, Thomas, you're making me have to go two separate directions with this, and it's difficult trying to figure out which way to go. I figured I'll stick to the larger picture once, and then hopefully you'll fill in as much detail as you possibly can. So,
Sure.
what is the point then of this separation? You know, it's like why have this I guess non-local information or direction that then has an effect or that we see as an effect on the physical? Why can't it all just be exist on one level then to where you just see who's doing what, when, and where?
Oh, I think I understand what you're saying. You know, it's kind of like the way that reality is put together. Uh,
Mm,
give you an example. And here's one of the things that this line of thinking, Adnan, causes us to consider things that we've never even connected before, but we know about, but we just haven't connected them with various phenomena. Let's take, for example, the Big Bang. Now, everybody knows what the Big Bang is. It's what physicists say brought the universe into being. It started out with a what they call a quantum singularity, infinitely dense and infinitely small. Now, singularity means there's only a single coordinate to describe it. It's not physical because everything that is physical is defined by four coordinates, three spatial and one temporal. So you have height, width, depth, and time. It's a four-dimensional physical reality. But a singularity only has a single dimension. And again, Adnan, this is one of these terms, singularity, that's been used so much in common language in the wrong way that people don't understand the actual mathematical or scientific meaning. It means that there's a single coordinate. And just the idea that scientists call it infinitely dense and infinitely small means that it can't be physical either because there is no value of infinity in the physical. Everything is measurable, and infinity is immeasurable. So, from that quantum singularity emerged the universe. They call it the Big Bang. It exploded. And one of the things that we do know is that the universe assembled itself in a very orderly way. For example, we didn't have a situation where one neutron, for example, that particles or elements of the creation began to try to assemble itself and disassemble itself at random until it finally came up with uh, a neutron, for example, and then every neutron after that was born from that one. It didn't happen that way. Um, Neutrinos, for example, which are elementary particles, they began to appear everywhere in the universe at the same time, according to the exact same design and model, which means that the information that went in to their formation in the early universe predated the universe. The information that neutrinos and other elementary particles were designed after, even the fabric of space-time itself, the geometry of space-time, all that information was programmed into that singularity. And so when to ask why can't we see what's going on the other side and why does it have to be this way? It's just the way the universe is put together. So here we have, once understanding this idea about information and non-locality, we can actually make the connection that paranormal phenomena very much behaves, and the mechanics behind it seem to uh, reflect the very process that brought the universe into being. So there's a reason why we can't see what's on that other side, so to speak, because it's not physical. What we do see is when it becomes physical, when the information materializes, just like it did in the early universe. And of course, Adnan, then that leaves us, brings us to the next leap, is that if this is the case, then the singularity is still there. That it didn't just dissolve into the universe, that the universe is still emerging from that singularity, which would explain why the universe is expanding. Whereas the conventional physics, the materialistic physics, has not been able to explain why the universe is expanding. So when we look at it this way, that the universe is still emerging from the singularity, the information in it is still materializing. Uh, Not only does it explain certain things that are still a mystery in physics, but it can explain why paranormal events, so to speak, where you have these non local effects that are measurable and observed, materialize out of nowhere, literally, and then they dematerialize again from information that isn't stored in the local space. Uh, so that's kind of my way of explaining what I think you were asking about. I hope that addresses what you were asking about.
It does. So, which leads me then to the next question. Generally, not all, but some scientists stay away from the big G word, and based on what you're describing, would you go as far as saying that there is a deliberate creation behind this, or do you still think like some of the scientists say, well, it just all kind of accidentally came into being?
Yeah, it all kind of happened by itself. um, well, you're right, Adnan, and here's what the implication is. And you're right that for a lot of physicists, it's like the old maps that they used to draw 16, 1700s, even before, where they showed you the edge of the world where the sea serpents were. And, here be monsters. And if you sailed too far, you would fall off the edge of the world. This is why physicists like to confine themselves to what is physical, because the implications, uh, they don't really, they don't really like the implications. You're right. Give you another example. And again, Adnan, what you'll notice in my work is that I'll take known principles that are established in the scientific community, and just apply them in ways that they haven't been applied before. Give you an example. Let's talk about systems. Um, let's say, for example, we take a system. Uh, uh, let's say it's like a pond in a field or in a wood somewhere. There's a pond. That's an ecosystem. That's what we call it. Or even what I mentioned, I like to talk about a 57 Chevy. 57 Chevy is also a system. We can define it. We can talk about the principles as to how it's put together and how it operates. Now, systems give rise to subsystems, and those subsystems can often grow in complexity. If you take again, if you talk about a pond, and you start thinking about all the subsystems that derive from that pond, the microbes, the fish, plants there, bird can come and, defecate and the seeds are in it and then the plants start growing. You can grow in great complexity with subsystems. But here's the key, Adnan, that a subsystem will never behave in a way that is contrary to or outside of the laws and principles that govern the system which gave rise to the subsystems. For example, take the 57 Chevy. You could define that system. You can classify, you could define it, you can explain the principles by which it's put together and the way it behaves. But everything that is in that car will never be contrary to the laws and principles that govern the system that defines it. For example, you could not fly that 57 Chevy to Pluto. That would be outside of the laws and principles that govern the system, which defines that 57 Chevy. Would never be outside of it. Again, here's another extreme example that I like to use. Let's say you're putting your Thanksgiving turkey in the oven for the holiday. Well, you're not going to open that oven 4 hours later and find a Wankel rotary engine. You're going to find the turkey that you put in. And it's going to be cooked according to the heat and all the other ingredients that you put in, according to the laws and principles that established and define the system that we're considering. And you remember I told you before the interview, so sometimes you have to explain things in a way to give a background so you can actually give a meaningful answer. The universe is a system. Now, this is crazy. People have really blew their minds when they thought about what I'm saying here. Of course, it's established principle, just never applied it this way. The universe is a system. That means everything that developed in it is a subsystem of the universe. The fabric of space-time is a subsystem of the laws and principles that govern the universe. And we know now that the laws and principles are universal throughout the universe. We didn't know that before. I remember when I first started going to school, they weren't sure whether different laws of physics applied elsewhere in the universe. Now we're very confident that the laws of physics are universal. So, the formation of gravity is a subsystem of the universe. The formation of stars and planets and galaxies, these are all subsystems of the main system, which is the universe. We're still discovering the laws and principles that govern the universe, but all of the subsystems that it gives rise to, uh, atomic particles, name it, whatever it is, all of those behave in a way that is consistent with the laws and principles that govern the universe at large. None of these things are contrary to the laws of the universe, and none of the content in the universe transcends the universe. In other words, it doesn't go outside of the laws and principles that governs the greater universe itself. Remember, Carl Sagan was fond of saying, "We're all made of star stuff." And that's kind of the general idea, um, that the stars actually gave off the materials that gave rise to the planets and life and all that. Here's the thing. Let's take a look at a human being. Based on what I'm talking about, Adnan, would you think that a human being is a subsystem of the universe?
Well, based on what you explained, I would say the body is.
Well, yeah, it's a system that formed in the universe according to laws and principles that govern it. The materials that we're made of and the way they're put together follow those universal laws and principles. Now, there's a few things about the human being that's very interesting. First of all, of course, we're alive, Adnan. We are living beings. Second of all, we're intelligent. We could take information and form it into its equivalent in the physical world. We're intelligent. Now, just thinking about that one statement I just made, we could spend a 10-hour interview talking about. But the other thing is, the aspect of what I just mentioned means that we are creative, that we are able to create that which did not exist before. And as far as we know, as far as living things, to the extent that we do it, we know of no other creature or anything on earth that can do that. So, human beings, as a subsystem of the universe, are alive, they are intelligent, they are creative. If we're going to follow the principles, the scientific principles of systems and subsystems, what that tells us, Adnan, that life, intelligence, and creativity are built into the laws and principles that govern the universe. The universe is alive, it is intelligent, and it is creative. Otherwise, someone would have to argue that somehow the human being transcended or contradicted the laws and principles of the greater universe that gave rise to it. Now, some people have considered that concept when I've talked about actually a life changing concept. It changed the way that they looked at themselves and the world around them. So, yes, now, if we follow this a step further to answer your question, because like I said, Adnan, if these answers were simple, we'd already know them. It'd all be grammar school stuff. We take this a step further and we understand that the laws and principles that gave rise to the universe existed in the quantum singularity prior to the physical universe, then that means that source, that singularity from which the universe materialized, had life, intelligence, and creativity. There's no other way to escape it. There's no way to avoid that when you take the logic to that extent, because anything that you would argue to the contrary would be in violation of known scientific principles.
So, Thomas, when you asked me that question, I know you weren't trying to trick me, but for me, it's a trick question because I always considered or would look at a human as in two aspects, kind of similar to what you're talking about, because there's the soul and then there's the part, that's physical, being controlled by it, to say in very simplistic terms. Um, can you maybe talk a little bit about that based on from your findings, from your point of view, about the correlation with soul and body? Is that possible?
Absolutely. Because according to supergeometric theory, this is one of the beauties of the work, Adnan, is that once you begin to grasp the principles that are involved, the traditional barriers or boundaries between supernatural, between normal or science, and between religion or spirituality, they begin to blur. Everything begins to condense in the same greater picture, which ultimately the ultimate truth would have to be that way. Um, so the first thing we would have to do, Adnan, is define what the soul is. What is the soul? Um, People have an impression, and some people have their own opinions what it is. But if we look deeply, let's say in the Bible, which addresses issues like this, um, the soul is the essence of what makes that person an individual. So, for example, uh, and here's how we would relate it: if neutrinos materialized in the physical universe from a specific set of information that was contained in the quantum singularity, the non physical quantum singularity prior to the Big Bang, and that the universe and the information or the structures in it were materialized from the information that was in that quantum singularity. We might also say that the human being is a materialization of the information that's contained in the soul. That each soul is unique and has a certain collection of information that distinguishes it from every other soul that ever lived and that ever will live. Many things are similar, but there's some things that are different. And so, consequently, if we define the soul in that way, then we are looking at living beings that are being continuously materialized from the information that's contained in the soul.
So, Thomas, how would you then take this and apply to the subject that this channel deals a lot, which is, extraterrestrials, UFOs? Would it
Ah,
be the same approach as the universe took with us humans that it took with possibly other intelligent beings as well?
well, you're asking the $1 million question, at least for this channel. Now, there's been a lot of study that's gone into ufology. And we know that there's a lot of it that's been stagnated, that there's a lot of ufology enthusiasts that feel that they're basically running in the same circles over and over again, that they're really not making any progress. Here's the challenge is that we're looking at a phenomena that occurs at a distance. Uh, when we're talking about ufology, and it's generally occurring at a scale that is larger than a human scale, size wise. But now, let's take for a moment. Let's think about paranormal phenomena. Okay, what we have. We have a number of of effects that we see in paranormal phenomena. Uh, we see materializations, information that is materializing in front of our eyes. Even if you hear a disembodied voice, that's a non-local materialization because there's no vocal cords local to the sound. And yet the sound is still materializing. Um, we know that in in paranormal phenomena, we have thermal effects, which we could talk about if we get time. How all these things come about. Um, we also have, which is very interesting, on the onset of paranormal love of a paranormal event, investigators sometimes report the malfunctioning of their electrical equipment. Now, the conventional explanation is all the spirit is drawing energy in order to materialize, in order to manifest. Well, guess what? Exact same phenomenon occurs in ufology. We're in the vicinity of a UFO. Sometimes the radio stops working, the car stops, it won't start, it won't run. Nobody ever says that the UFO is drawing energy from your car battery in order to materialize. Um, you see in paranormal phenomena manifestations like apparitions that float. Sometimes you see poltergeist activity where objects move without any visible means of propulsion. Is this beginning to sound familiar, Adnan?
Hmm.
So imagine if we were able to discover, which I believe I've got the beginning parts of it, what I call paranormal mechanics. The actual physics as yet to be discovered physics that explains paranormal events. Because let's face it, these events occur within the physical universe, so they must conform to the laws and principles that govern the greater universe in which they are a component. If someone was able to unlock the physics behind paranormal events, what could we do? We could build a UFO. We could build, we could affect anti gravity. We could travel without any means of propulsion. And furthermore, if the information is being materialized from a non local source, we could have things like teleportation and materialization. Gives us an insight into how alien craft might be able to reach our local space while bypassing the normal limitations of space and time, where established physics says, well, people, aliens could not be coming to us from a certain star system, for example, because it would just take too long. It would take too long and too much energy to get here, too many hundreds of years or whatever. Well, not if they know, if they've mastered the techniques or the mechanics behind teleportation, which we know in paranormal phenomena, paranormally active sites, teleports can exist, can happen. So here's the thing, too, Adnan, about paranormal phenomena. It's local in terms of it happens close at hand to us, sometimes right in front of us, sometimes just feet away at a paranormally active site. and it's on a human scale. We're not looking at something that could be 300 feet across, 10,000 feet in the air. We're looking at things on human scale right in front of us in our own local space. So the study of paranormal phenomena, in my opinion, leads us to insights into what a UFO might be, how it might be put together, how it could operate and work. As far as aliens, think about this. Remember, I was talking about this system and subsystem type of thing. And this is where these concepts opens the door wide open. That's why I call my book Behind the Cosmic Veil, because essentially it tears the cosmic veil in two and allows us to look past it, look beyond us. If we are alive and we are a subsystem of the greater universe, and the laws and principles that govern the formation of life are part of the universal code, then anywhere in the universe that conditions are right, life will form. It's an explanation as to why, even in our own planet, our own world, um, scientists cannot figure out how life arose from inanimate matter. They don't know how how life came into being. I always, in the theory of evolution, I I always say about evolution that it's a great theory, but it is a but it is a statement that started in mid sentence. The last half of the sentence looks great, but the first half of the sentence is missing, because evolution cannot define how life emerged from inanimate matter. So, any kind of a spontaneous materialization like that, see how I'm even using the same terminologies to describe all these different things? If life was a spontaneous materialization, then the laws and principles which can give rise to life are programmed into the laws and principles of the universe. Otherwise, we would say that the formation of life breaks the laws of the universe, and that really cannot be. So, if life formed here, life can form elsewhere. If intelligence can form here, intelligence can form elsewhere. And if creativity can form here, creativity can form elsewhere. Anywhere in the universe where a planetary environment is sufficiently dynamic, not like the moon, which is static and dead, or like Mars, which is almost static, but not quite. But it's good to think of the moon where it's static, it's dead. There's no dynamism in it. Uh, there's no weather, there's no volcanoes, there's no plate tectonics. There's none of those dynamisms are at work. But that dynamic state has to exist for a long enough time. And I say anywhere planetary conditions are sufficiently dynamic and sufficiently stable on a long period of time, life must form. It has to. It's just like taking two uh, atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen and combining them in a molecule under standard temperature and pressure with a sufficient gravitational field to draw those atoms or those molecules together. It must form water. It must form a clear liquid we call water anywhere in the universe where those conditions exist.
So, Thomas, I have to track back just a little bit. So, can you go more into the information or the part where you were trying to say something about how, especially people that are into ghosts and would say, the ghost is draining energy from this area, or the UFOs, weird things happen. Can you maybe explain a little bit more what you think that is? So is it just a basically a shifting around of molecules that are within that area?
Good question. Good question. When the universe arose, and again, add the theory of the Big Bang has been staring us in the face for decades, and no one had recognized what the significance of it is. When the universe came into existence, the first thing that arose was an expanding bubble of space time. And then the information for the elementary particles began to materialize within the fabric, the geometry, the scaffolding, the framework of that spatial field. Einstein taught us that space-time is actually a substantive field. It's not an empty nothingness like Newton said. It actually is a substantive field that can bend light. Um, Now that happened when there was no universe. The universe came into being. But let's say if we had a little kind of a little Big Bang. Um, let's say, for example, it happened in a living room in a haunted house. What would be the first thing we would see? First thing we would see is an expanding bubble of space time. It would begin to emerge from a superphysical source, from a source outside the physical. Now, if it happened in a vacuum, that would be one thing, but it's happening in local space with what Einstein called physical content. So, what's happening is the physical content that is occupying the space that's beginning to bend will get distorted and it will be compressed. Now, what happens when we compress atoms and molecules? They become excited. And one of the things that happens when they're excited is that the electrons jump up in their higher valences inside the atoms. And so what you would measure is an electromagnetic field emerging from nowhere, literally from thin air. So the excitation of these atoms and molecules and the particles they're made of occupying that rim, that edge of that expanding bubble where they're being compressed would produce an electromagnetic field. Another thing that the excitement of those electrons would cause is that they would, as they drop back down in their valences, they emit photons. So we would have a luminous phenomena that could be occurred as well. Um, we see it every day. We make use of it all the time in our modern world, where we excite a material with a flow of electrons. It causes the electrons in those orbits to jump up into higher orbits, a higher energy level. When they drop back down, they emit photons, and that is what's called an LED. That's how we have light emitting diodes that can emit photons without having a filament like an incandescent bulb. Um, Another thing that would happen is that we would see a heat signature because that pressure and that activity in that skin around that bubble is generating heat. So we would also see heat, electromagnetism, possibly luminescence. Now, when that's expanding in physical content, we're talking about the atmosphere here, air that would be present in a room in a haunted house. One of the things that would happen is that it would create a temporary partial vacuum inside the bubble.
Oh, and that would
And
explain the temperature shift. Is that what you're implying?
yeah, because we know, Adnan, from basic science, that heat energy, let's say in local space in your house, is stored in the, it's held in the atoms and molecules that comprise the air. You reduce those particles, those atoms and molecules, in a given cubic feet of space, and the temperature will drop inside. So now we have a cold spot. But on the outside, where the expanding bubble is pushing, we would have a heat signature. This is how paranormal investigators see heat signatures and feel cold spots at the same time. Another thing that accompanies an expanding bubble of space-time is a gravitational field. Now, these are known scientific principles. They've never been applied this way before because we didn't have an operational theory that put all these ideas together. And I'll explain that in a second. Uh, it would create a gravitational field, an expanding bubble of space-time. And this is very interesting because Einstein worked on this too. This is where he came up with his wormhole theory, um, or what's called more scientifically an Einstein-Rosen bridge. He was trying to theorize a structure of an expanding opening in physical space that would create a gravitational field without having physical mass to create it. That's a wormhole. So isn't it funny that paranormal investigators sometimes, just before the onset of a paranormal event, they they report having a feeling of heaviness, and they always use the same word, Adnan. They never call it anything else. Now we all know what heaviness would feel like if you're in a roller coaster or something. So this model of what I call an expanding diffluential field bubble can give explanations to all, not just one phenomenon, but all the collection of phenomena that we see at a paranormal event or a paranormally active site. There's more to it than this, too. There's other things that this explains. Um, for example, EVPs, where they record something on an electronic device that it's not heard with the ears. Well, if you have an expanding bubble of space-time and vocal information is materializing within that bubble, the surface of that bubble will begin to resonate with that materializing vocalization. It could cause an audible phenomena from the acoustical waves that are being given off by that surface, but it can also cause an electromagnetic phenomenon where the information is conveyed via an electromagnetic compression wave to the recording device that the ear cannot hear because the ear can't hear electromagnetic compression waves. It's not built to do it.
So can I ask
On
you
and on and on.
quick two questions?
Mhm.
So first one is kind of along the same lines what you were just discussing. So if there was to, would it be a matter of physical matter that basically, let's say, in case of a UFO, uh, or not so much a ghost, that if a person was within that same area and something was basically materializing, could that cause damage to somebody, or would we only feel it in these impressions and things like cold and heaviness and things like that, or would there be actual harm happening?
Well, it could be harmful to people, and people have gotten sick and nauseated when these events began to occur. I mean, if you're bending the space that your body's occupying, it's going to react to it. Of course, if the space is bending in a sufficient way, everything is bending at the same time, so you can't detect it physically. Um, but yes, there's another aspect of it too that was accidentally stumbled upon by a paranormal researcher, by another paranormal researcher investigator. Um, one, if these little openings, what you would call a event horizon, um, I call it an expanding diffluential field bubble. He called it a wormhole. He felt that a wormhole was actually opening in local space. One of the things that we know that happened in the early universe is that when the universe began to materialize, one of the exotic particles that was created was antimatter. And antimatter, when it collides with matter, there's little tiny microscopic, subatomic explosions. But what they do, Adnan, is give off gamma radiation. And he started testing for gamma at paranormal sites and was able to detect it in places where no known normal source could create gamma radiation of that intensity. We're talking about inside nuclear reactors. We're talking about lightning strikes. We're talking about to get gamma, you need to generate a lot of energy unless you have antimatter. And so he began, and in fact, in one site, that the gamma was rising so high that he asked his investigative team to leave the room because
Can
it
I
was
ask you,
reaching
like,
dangerous levels.
can I ask you the second question before we
Hmm.
go too far up? So, well, in a way, this will almost force it to change the subject, maybe. So, I only know it as. Have you heard of the two-slit experiment?
Oh,
Okay,
absolutely.
so based on your understanding of what you've written about, looking at that experiment and what had happened, can you analyze it and kind of give me your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. And this has been postulated before. David Bohm, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, by no means a fringe or a quack. He was mainstream and at the top of his field. Uh, he stated once that the two-slit experiment uh, is is the only mystery of quantum mechanics and the entire mystery of quantum mechanics. And what we're looking at, because part of the two-slit experiment uh, is that we have waves of interference that result on the projection screen, so to speak. And what's weird about it is if they fire one photon at a time, collectively, those photons create the same interference pattern on the screen, as if every photon knew exactly what happened before and what happened afterwards, or what was going to happen in the future, so it could take its proper place on the screen. So, according to my theory, what the two slit experiment illustrates is the fact that there is a greater reality. There's a non physical reality from which the physical reality is emerging. And so, It's that non-physical or pre-physical or super-physical or super geometric that determines where these electrons are landing on the screen. They are what's causing the interference pattern, because the interference pattern is part of what generates them. Um, Louis de Broglie, I think it was 1923, wrote a paper where he introduced the idea of guide waves, that he believed the entire two-slit experiment was being established, determined by what he called guide waves. Um, but in his work, he believed the guide waves were emerging from the experimental system itself. Again, we're talking about a system and the subsystems that are generated by it. According to my theory, those guide waves occur superphysically, so
So,
that the waves actually
oh,
materialize into the experiment.
sorry, you took a long break. I thought you were ready for me with the next question. So, is there anything else you wanted to cover in this? And this can then prelude to questions, so that if people have any, please go ahead and put any questions in there. But is there anything else that you wanted to cover subject wise?
Oh my goodness. Well, there's a whole there's this whole slew of implications uh, from this theory. We could talk for hours about it, various aspects of it. Uh, but again, if I wanted to go back to the idea about UFOs, about ufology, uh, I really believe that the study of paranormal phenomena would allow us to discover the mechanics that are at work. Um, and that in turn would allow us to build technology based on those principles that would pretty much be able to reproduce anything that UFOs do. Um, and one thing I did want to mention about theory, and I talk about this in my book actually, uh, for centuries, people have known what earthquakes were. They could tell you how they behaved. Uh, they would know all the manifestations of earthquakes, just like in paranormal phenomena. Any researcher or enthusiast could tell you all the things that happen at a paranormally active site. Same thing. Volcanoes, same thing. We've known them for centuries. We know exactly what happens when they manifest, when they materialize. But we didn't know what their cause was. And we didn't understand what the underlying mechanics were of it until in the late 1950s, early 1960s, some very bold geologists uh, reintroduced an idea that was first introduced by Sir Francis Bacon, the idea of continental drift. In fact, up until this time, a geologist could be blacklisted for supporting the idea that there was such a thing as continental drift. Uh, Younger people don't understand this. They don't remember back in that day when those principles were unknown. And in fact, they were considered taboo. When I went to school, one of the things that they thought that could have caused the craters on Earth or on the moon was that when the moon was liquid inside, that bubbles came out from the core. And when they reached the cold air, they popped. And that's what caused a crater on the moon. Trust me, I'm old enough to remember being taught that that was one of the things they thought it could be. Anyway, we didn't understand what was actually causing earthquakes and volcanoes until the idea of continental drift was revisited and revisited seriously. And from that came the theory of plate tectonics. Now, here's the crazy thing. Once we understood plate tectonics and how the continental plates move and collide and drift underneath of each other and the effects that that causes, now even a school child could explain the basic mechanics of an earthquake that for centuries escaped the greatest minds in the field. We also now know that volcanoes are caused by the same kind of activity. See, we never knew before that earthquakes and volcanoes were caused by the same underlying events. And as an added bonus, Adnan, we understood from that theory that plate tectonics was also responsible for mountain formations. It was a free bonus. It was like a bonus piece of information. Here it is. Now you can see. And the only difference between coming upon that knowledge and not knowing what was going on was the theoretical model to plug all the data into. We didn't have to come up with any new findings. We had findings for centuries. But it was only the theoretical model that put it all together and made everything make sense. And now it's perfectly understandable. Whereas before, you know, not 75 years ago, it was a complete mystery. Uh, Supergeometric theory is one of those ideas. It's one of those theories that takes all these disparate pieces of factoids and puts them together in a consistent model that through that model, that theoretical model, so many things are plain as day, whereas before they were shrouded in mystery.
So, so everyone else watching, if you would like to ask a question of Thomas, simply submit it in the chat with the 3 stars. So we'll be waiting for those. But Thomas, I wanted to ask you something I personally experienced, and I don't know if this also happens within your circles. Long time ago, when I was very naive, there's even I think a video of that of me. No disrespect to anyone that was on the panel, all very respectable people that I personally have up number one on my list. But I asked them, I said, they were all, I said, well, you do this part and you do the other part, and the other person does that. Have you guys considered working together to really get to the bottom of this, instead of just kind of having these individual strengths going down their own little research path? And so after I was done asking, it was kind of silent, it was kind of like, it didn't seem like that they wanted to. Do you find the same thing in, that in science is kind of sort of the same way that they don't really want to collaborate unless they have to?
Well, I think to an extent that's true in any field. Everybody has their own pet work. Everybody has their own particular theories and what they're working on. Uh, for example, just in the paranormal field, for example, uh, there are people who specialize in studying EVPs, electronic voice phenomena. They don't want to know anything about apparitions, in that they don't want to consider what causes an apparition, because paranormal effects, there's almost like a catalog of them. You could list a catalog and say, these are the things that can occur and do occur in paranormally active sites. Well, a group will study one of those effects but don't want to consider the other because since all these effects occur collectively, they must be due to the same underlying mechanics. So if they're figuring out mechanics for electronic voice phenomena, they don't want to consider the apparition because the appearance of the apparition would negate what their theories are about EVP because they both have to be on the same principle. And they can't explain apparitions with their EVP theories. And so you get those kinds of things. From the scientific community, uh, there's a lot of intellectual elitism and intellectual jealousy. Everybody wants to come up with the next best thing, and they're all working on their own little worlds, so to speak. So helping or working, collaborating with someone else doesn't necessarily help them. They're not looking for the truth. They're looking for their own personal discovery. And so, yes, and in any field, it's like that. I could, you know, name fishing lure collectors, and you'll find the same kind of thing, and it becomes very competitive.
I wonder sometimes, um, it's not necessarily the when it comes to exchanging ideas and talking about certain things, I'm very much open to it. But I know when it comes to then to the eventual presentation, because I don't want it to be twisted and pulled in certain ways. It's like I almost want to use the word control the way it comes out, because that way I know that what I've learned has been conveyed the way that I've seen it and experienced, instead of
Uh-huh.
then having to use with other people's terminology and their points of views and things like that.
Yeah, it's true. For example, in my book, I came up with a great way to uh, redefine paranormal phenomena or supernatural phenomena. Yeah, I don't remember them all off top of my head. I'd have to look at the book itself. It's been years since I've talked about it. But uh, let's say when something is moved supernaturally from one location to another, I call it a translocation.
Hmm.
When the nature of something changes uh, due to non-local causality, I call it a transmutation. And then there's transmigration. It reclassified all the old, gosh, the 2 century old terminology that the paranormal field still uses. And it's such a superior system because it's very descriptive. It actually addresses what the underlying mechanism is that's going on. Uh, but no one has ever adopted it because it scares the bejeepers out of them. They are, the paranormal field is filled with self proclaimed experts, just like the ufology field is, just like the ancient alien field is. And they are not going to accept or adopt something that blows away their model of what they think is going on. So, yeah, people have not adopted it because they want to talk about an apparition or EVP. They want to. This is what they're familiar with. They want to talk about ghosts and demons and all that. With what they're familiar with, and they've become, self-proclaimed gurus of it. And they don't want to reorganize everything that well, basically says pretty much everything that you know is wrong. And this is actually a more sound and logical system, and that everybody could use it to communicate about any phenomena, whether we're talking about gravity or paranormal phenomena or ufology or the two-slit experiment. uses the same set of terminology. That's very, very frightening to people. And they lose what makes them unique. It's just like all these guys out here admitting that are hunting Bigfoot, and they have TV shows. We're hunting Bigfoot, and they have conventions, conferences about Bigfoot. Guess what? I bet half of those guys go to bed at night and pray. They pray that no one ever, ever drags in a body. Because if you dragged in a body or I dragged in a body, guess what? We're suddenly the world's leading expert because we actually have the body. And whatever scientific team examines it will know what it is and what's going on. There'll be no more mysteries. The conferences will disappear. The TV shows will disappear. The self-proclaimed gurus writing and selling books to their groupies and, getting paid for lectures, they would all disappear. Their
I think
careers
it'll
would be
evolve
over.
in some way. I mean, people just for being people always find some way to meet about something.
I understand, but in all of those fields, the um, the gurus survive on the perpetuation of the mystery, not on the solution.
Right. So I wanted to ask you another question. So I can't remember exactly in the very beginning how much you got into this, and I apologize. I was paying attention, but I can't recall. So this that initially jarred you to go down this path and write this book and whatnot. Was it a single event or is it ongoing?
No, several events,
Hmm.
several experiences that I was cognizant enough and educated enough to realize that these things really occurred. There was no conventional explanation, but yet they were real. And B, that established physics did not have a universal model, a model of reality in which these things could fit into. So either our understanding, our model of the universe, the principles, laws and principles we understand govern the universe, uh, I had personal proof that they were either incomplete or incorrect. And so the question for me became, let's come up with a theoretical model that does include all observable phenomena. And that's what started my research.
Okay. But was it you weren't too distraught by it? You just thought it was something interesting happening, right? And then you're like, "Oh, I can do something with this."
Oh, I wasn't disturbed or distraught about it. I was fascinated. And it was that fascination and that intellectual curiosity,
Hmm.
you know. I was one of these kids that always used to ask why. When someone explained something, I would say, why? 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 And I wasn't just playing a game. I seriously wanted to know. Sometimes I would get punished for it.
Right.
Uh, but I honestly wanted to know why. You're going to tell me this and that. Why? You're going to say that such a thing is so and so. Why? I have to do this. Why? Not being a wise guy. If I understood why, I'd be all with it. It's I learned how to distrust the establishment at a very, very early age.
I think some of us eventually get to that point of that very distrust. So Thomas, I have some people they're saying good to hear from you again, and they're always interested in what you have to say, and generally love the show. But we haven't had any questions yet. Do you want to continue with some other subject, or what do you feel like doing?
Well, we could talk about more aspects of this.
Sure.
Uh, let's talk about this. One of the things that I've been able to formulate from this theory is a one sentence statement about the universe, which is really freaky. Uh, because, like I said, this super geometric theory expands your mind. It allows you to travel into places that you never would have thought of before and make connections that couldn't have been made before. Um, what I say is that the universe is an expression of materialized and materializing information. That really covers the entire universe. Now, everything else is a subsystem of that.
Right.
Based on the material, on the information that's available. Um, Here, give you an example. Here's what some of the conclusions from my theory have been. First of all, supergeometric theory says that there is no such thing as dark matter. Now, for listeners who aren't aware of it or haven't heard the explanation, in materialistic physics, every observable effect has to have a local physical cause. This is materialism. This is what physics operates under. Now, what we have found over time is that we have been able to observe in the universe much more gravitational effect than what physical mass is there to account for it. Let's say, for example, we could talk about the gravity of the Earth and we know about its mass and all that. And those things locally we understand. But when we look out on the universe, we see gravitational effects that are far in excess of the visible matter, the visible mass that can account for it. It would be uh, like the Earth having 10 times the gravitational field that it actually has, as small as it is. Since every effect must have a local physical cause, and the conventional view is that gravity is the result of mass. It's mass that generates gravity. Then we must have, I forget the latest calculations, that 85 or 88% or whatever of the mass in the physical universe is invisible. It cannot be detected because we have 80 some percent more gravitational effect that we observe in the universe than we have physical matter to explain it. So dark matter is supposed to be this invisible mass that generates the other 80 some percent of the gravity that we observe. It is a fantasy. It is an imaginary substance. Literally is an imaginary substance.
Dark matter.
Yes,
Mm.
it's imaginary. We can't detect it. They've been searching for it in all different kinds of ways. And basically, it doesn't exist. And yet, they have to use a physical substance to explain all the gravitational effect observed because in the material dogma, the material religion of physics, every physical effect must have a local physical cause connected to it. And if we can't find it, we just have to make it up. Now, here's what my theory says, and this is where it gets really crazy, Adnan, is that all we know that all mass is surrounded by a field of gravity. You might have learned that in school. Um, so, like if two human beings were in spacesuits and they were floating in the vacuum of gravitationless space, they would eventually attract each other because the gravitational field that surrounds them. You may have heard of that. A lot of people have.
How far apart would they have to be?
Well, I don't know. Somebody who's familiar with gravitational mechanics would be able to tell you precisely based on the mass how far the effect would be. But they would eventually gather together. It's like what they say about planet formation, where we had these particles surrounding stars in rings, and over a period of time they would begin to attract together and start coagulating, and eventually it would form a planet. This is our understanding of it. Well, according to my theory, gravitational fields are the effect of informational materialization. In other words, the cause of gravity is not in the physical universe. It's outside of it. And I'm not the only guy who's ever thought of that before. Theodore Kaluza was the first one in helping working with Einstein on his unified field theory. Einstein was never able to express gravity mathematically throughout the four dimensions. He couldn't get it to work. Height, width, depth, time. It couldn't work. Uh, so what Theodore Kaluza did was he added a fifth coordinate into the equation. He said, let's just see if this happens. What would happen? So he added a fifth coordinate, worked Einstein's formulas according to that pattern. I'm not a mathematician, so I couldn't tell you exactly what he did. And then at the end of the equation, he subtracted the fifth coordinate and got the proper expression for a unified field that would describe gravity in four dimensions. That's crazy. But what ultimately occurred, Theodore Kaluza came to a conclusion later in his life that gravity was non-local, that gravity was not being formed or caused by anything in four-dimensional space-time, which is astounding. Now, remember when I talked about the Big Bang?
Yeah.
And remember, Adnan, you can, and I've had radio hosts tell me this oftentimes. They've had people in talking about all kinds of things. Nobody described a subject like this in this kind of detail and with this kind of scope. So this is something. When the Big Bang emerged, the first thing that was created was a bubble of space-time with an accompanying gravitational field caused by the curvature of that bubble. Now, this is very interesting because there was yet no mass. If you ever read up on physicists, astrophysicists trying to research the Big Bang, one of the things they're looking for is waves of gravity that can be traced back to the Big Bang before there was any mass to generate it. Again, this is what led Einstein along the line of a Einstein-Rosen bridge or a wormhole. He was looking for a structure that could exist in space-time that could generate gravity without having mass. Now, isn't that interesting? Because dark matter is imaginary mass to explain all this excess gravity. Whereas we have enough background to conclude, if we were not stuck in the material religion, that gravity is caused non-locally, like Calusa said, because when the universe came into being, there was a gravitational field before there was any mass that could generate it. Now, we also know there's gravitational fields around all what I say materializations. And I've talked about an opening in space-time, what I call an expanding bubble of space-time at paranormal sites in which information can materialize that creates a gravitational field where there's no mass to generate it. And this is why I say that paranormal events, the mechanics behind the paranormal phenomena, duplicates what happened at the Big Bang. Now, in the paranormal, what I say is that a space-time bubble forms like a mini Big Bang, and information from the singularity, from the supergeometric realm. Anybody that's into the uh, uh, psychic kind of studies would be familiar with Edgar Casey. He called it the Akasha. Uh, David Bohm called it implicate order. Finkelstein called it coherent superpositions. These are all established. Those guys are established mainstream physicists. They're coming up with these ideas. But to make a long story short, if we take paranormal phenomena and the Big Bang as a model, what that tells us is this, and this is frightening almost in its implications. It's not that mass generates matter or generates gravity. It's not that mass generates gravity. It's that information materializes in the mass within these wells of gravity that are being caused superphysically.
You're gonna have to say that one more time.
Yeah, because in other words, the mechanics of what's going on in the supergeometric, the superphysical, is creating these bubbles in space-time, just like it did at the beginning of the universe. And information materializes in these bubbles of space-time. The bubbles themselves already have a gravitational field just by the expansion of the local space. So creating of that bubble generates a gravitational field, which is why supergeometry says there's no such thing as dark matter, because the universe is actually containing gravity that's being caused by these expanding bubbles everywhere that have no mass inside. So let me say it again, is that according to the supergeometric model, these gravity wells, if you will, are formed in space-time from the mechanics that are happening superphysically, supergeometrically. They are actually forming these bubbles in space-time. And the information that's dropping down into them materializes inside the bubble. It's almost like a crucible or a womb in which
So you're saying that's what almost kind of then initially drew everything together to form the planets?
well, yes, every particle is surrounded by a gravitational field. The difference in supergeometry theory, supergeometric theory, is that according to conventional theory, the mass generates gravity. According to supergeometric theory, the gravity, well, is where information is materialized into mass. That's astounding. Because if that is correct, Adnan, what I have just spoken is equivalent to cracking the code of creation. I mean it. It's that profound. I at the one of the paradigm symposiums, I spent about 25 minutes talking to a woman who had an astrophysics degree. Her jaw was dropped the entire time. She said, "You just wiped out my entire education." She said, "What you're talking about solves puzzles in astrophysics that you don't even know about because you never took the courses and had the degrees." She was like astounded. This is just so revolutionary. In other words, the model of reality is actually reversed than what we think it is. So, yes, if you
So would
have
the gravitational pull be, forgive me if this sounds kind of stupid question to ask, but so then the gravitational pull would not be any stronger or weaker based on mass. It will just be whatever it is that was initially after it was created by that what you call it, space time.
it's the mechanics, it's the processes that occur super geometrically or super physically that cause the bubbles in space-time that create gravitational fields, and then the information coming from that super geometric realm drop down into these bubbles and materialize. It's the exact same thing where a bubble forms in a paranormal event and then an apparition materializes inside of it. It's the exact same thing that occurs. And what Calusa thought is that gravity actually precedes mass. Einstein came up with the wormhole to describe a formation, an expansion of space time, a bubble, so to speak, if you will, in space time that would have a gravitational field just by the mechanics of the bubble forming without having any mass causing the gravity. That was the only way he could solve certain problems with gravity. So, what we're talking about, and this is oversimplified, like when we fly satellites through the solar system, we're calculating the fields, the gravitational fields. But instead of having planets generating a gravitational field, we have gravitational fields in which planets are materialized. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. And so with that in relation to some of the other things that you, I guess for lack of a better word, discovered, what was there a general conclusion that you drew that you can talk about, or
Hmm. Yeah. Uh, Anything that can be imaged can be created. Now, I use the word image. General population uses the word imagination. I don't call it the imagination. I call it the imaging faculty that's in the brain. Because think about it. We can think, we can generate a coherent pattern of information in our imagination and then materialize it in the physical universe. Think about a sculptor or a painter. They image the coherent body of information that represents a form, and then they use their hands and the material in the earth to cause that image to be materialized in the physical universe. So what happens is that the entire universe, the entire reality works on the very same principles. Not only does it explain some mysteries in normal physics, but it also explains the supernatural. It also joins together many religious beliefs into a single set of principles that applies to everything. Um, here's something. Let's say that we accept the idea that telepathy is real or remote viewing. Let's say you're in New Jersey and you're remote viewing out in California and you see somebody with there's his 57 Chevy, a red 57 Chevy, you see it. You realize that all of that information about that 57 Chevy, about its geometry, its color, which is part of its physics, is being conveyed non-locally. There's no local physical connection between the recipient and the object. And that information pattern, that coherent pattern, enters the brain and it materializes as an electrochemical pattern. I just blew the lid off of parapsychology using the same mechanics that brought the universe into existence. And I'm not saying I'm not bragging, Adnan. You know me. I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm just saying this is what I did. Well, first of all, according to my theory, there is no such thing as dark matter. And I know people struggle with terminology to describe what they're trying to think and what they're trying to say and imagine because we don't have a standard set of terminology. Um, Let me say this, and I think I know what the listener is asking. Um, According to my understanding, there is only one reality, and that is the physical and the superphysical, the geometric and the supergeometric. It's together as one whole reality. Um, I don't know what we would how we would define. What did he say? Alternative reality? What did he say, Adnan?
He was. Wonder if I was muted. Maybe I was. It says, does Thomas think we might have the ability to manifest ourselves, minds, within that dark matter to create a reality outside of our current realm?
All right. Okay. Well, I know that he or she is trying to say something with the dark matter term. I understand that. Um, my 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 answer would be this. is that what would a reality be outside of our own? How would that be defined? See, this is where um, there was a paranormal researcher years ago named Dr. Stephen Rourke. He might still be involved in it. And one of the issues that he talked about is what he called the feathery realms. And it's not meant to be disrespectful. It's just meant to be after a certain point, people think about concepts that are ill defined. It's like saying a higher dimension, There's another, well, what is that dimension? How is it defined? So when we're talking about a different reality, that would have to be defined. What would be meant by that? Would it be a reality that followed the laws of physics as we know it, or the laws of physics as they actually are? Even though we don't know them all, we know there are laws and principles. There's grand laws and principles governing our reality. Would it be a reality different than that? Would it have a different set of laws and principles? And if it did have a set of laws and principles, would we even be able to exist in it? You see what I mean? The
Right, because
question,
I would. You said dark matter was. You said there was. You said that was just imaginary, right? Is that what you're
yeah,
saying?
dark matter
Okay.
according to supergeometric theory. And what's interesting, Adnan, is more and more physicists over the last handful of years have been coming to the same conclusion that there is no such thing as dark matter. Now,
So,
we know your
but this dark
listener
matter,
is
that's not to say it's the same thing as the vast blackness of space, right?
correct. Dark matter doesn't, according to supergeometric theory, and increasingly with increasing numbers of mainstream physicists, that there's no such thing as dark matter. So I know the listener is trying to say something that he or she is thinking about when they're using the term dark matter, but it's unclear what they're trying to say.
Right. Okay. All right. Is there any other subjects you want to cover? Because I know you went into gravity, and
Oh,
then
yeah. Yeah. Gravity is paranormal. Now, why do I say gravity is paranormal? Because remember, I define paranormal phenomena as effects that are the result of non local physical causes. So here we got, and they never explained this to us in school. They said in the school, well, the moon is revolving around the earth, it's orbiting the earth, and it's held in place with gravity. By what means? By what conveyance? I mean, like a radio broadcast has to be conveyed to the receiver through an electromagnetic wave, a physical wave. Electricity has to be conveyed in waves and particles, electrons. That's a duality. That's another thing. We haven't even cracked the subject of quantum mechanics. Oh my goodness. Because supergeometry creates a different model of that. Gravity, uh, they call it a force. But we also know scientifically it's kind of weird. It's an oxymoron that forces are conveyed by waves and also have a particulate form. So, for example, electromagnetism is conveyed by waves, electromagnetic waves that can be collapsed into particles that are called electrons. What conveys gravity? There is nothing, no physical particle or wave that connects the Earth to the moon. It's what Einstein quipped as spooky action at a distance. Newton just said that this is the way it is. He understood that there was gravity, but he couldn't explain anything other than saying it was the nature of physical reality to have gravity. He couldn't really get very specific about it. You know, Newton's apple and all that good stuff. Um, there is no physical wave because electricity is physical also. It's a wave. There's no physical wave and there's no particle of gravity. We have never found it. We have never found a wave of gravity, a gravity wave, which is different. You'll hear on the news that you hear what they've discovered gravitational waves. That's different than a gravity wave. Here's where we get into the specifics of the science. If you took a rock or a stone and threw it into water, it would create ripples. They're equivalent in the spatial field as gravitational waves. But those waves don't comprise the water. They're just a disturbance in the water. But a gravity wave would actually be a wave of gravity, like an electromagnetic wave is a wave of electromagnetism, physical. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as a graviton. In fact, in the standard model, these are the things that helped cause Calusa and myself to come to the conclusion that gravity is non-local. It's not caused by physical mass. There is no physical wave or particle that connects the Earth and the moon. So there's no conveyor of the quote unquote force of gravity. It actually works non-locally, which means in a sense that gravity is a paranormal phenomenon. The only thing that connects the Earth and the moon is space-time.
You mean by the creation of it and because of it creating that gravitational field? Is that what you mean?
Well, my theory says is that, and Calusa thought it too, is that gravity is the result of a super physical or super geometric process that creates these bubbles in space-time, which are surrounded by, or I should say, comprised of a gravitational field. There is no graviton. There's no such thing. There's no gravity wave. In fact, the standard model of the universe, which describes all particles and their interaction, doesn't even have a space for gravity. The standard model of the universe, the standard model of mass and energy, you can look it up, capital S, capital M, standard model, and find out what it is, doesn't even have a place for gravity. It has a place for all the other elementary particles and their behavior and interactions, but it has no place for a graviton. The last space that needed to be filled was for the Higgs boson. And there's all kinds of problems with the Higgs boson, too. that they don't talk about in public because it's bad press. It's bad for business. You know, what they discovered is nowhere near what they gave the public the impression of.
Thomas, so I wanted to just something real quick. So, Red Pill Doc, if you can maybe expound more on the original question that you had. I'm sorry I was initially muted, but I asked it again live. Maybe then, I can relate to Thomas again. But Thomas, on your end,
This is the previous question. Were they able to rephrase it?
that's why I just asked him to do. And
All right.
so, besides then seeing, having this effect and realizing how gravity works, were there any other things that were kind of um, that you then were able to look at and see? Well, this is labeled the wrong too. So not only is gravity, needs to be looked at in a different way. What else was there that you maybe found?
The hypothetical imaginary dark energy. Now, that's talked less about because it's more esoteric, it's more ambiguous. Astrophysicists and physicists do not know why the universe is expanding. It shouldn't. And most people have heard that they say the universe is continuing to expand. Well, here's the problem. The problem is, according to the materialistic physical dogma, religion, the paradigm of modern science, materialism, this shouldn't be happening because the gravitational content of the universe should, according to our conventional understanding, prevent the universe from expanding. It should be keeping in a tight collection, a tight cluster. The universe shouldn't be expanding. So, what they did was they made up an imaginary substance called dark energy. And dark energy is what's supposed to be pushing out the edges of the universe with sufficient force, energetic force, to counteract the gravitational content of the universe. That's what dark energy is. Because it's kind of esoteric and a little bit, up there in space, so to speak, they don't talk about it much because public can't understand it. It's difficult for them to understand that kind of a concept. But this is what they say is expanding the universe. Of course, dark energy is something that's imaginary. Nobody's ever seen it. Nobody can measure it. They're not even sure what it would be, what it would comprise. However, in a materialistic universe, where every effect must have a local physical cause connected to it, a materialist has no choice in explaining the expansion of the universe except to make up an imaginary substance and say this is what's doing it. I mean, this sounds crazy that modern physics does this, but that's what they do. They're making up these substances. They have absolutely no evidence for their existence other than an observable effect with no detectable physical cause,
So
which
other
goes,
scientists know that, and they just kind of use it
oh,
and continue using it.
They know it. And amongst themselves, they know it. And if you read certain scientific journals, you'll hear it discussed. But to the general public, they don't want to reveal that because it makes it sound like they don't know what they're talking about, which essentially is true.
Hmm.
They don't know what it is. Now, here's the weird thing, Adnan. This is the thing that is the bone in their throat. The universe is expanding, but the objects in it are not. In other words, it would be like if you had a jar full of marbles and the jar keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
And the marbles aren't moving?
The marbles stay the same size. The space they occupy is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's not like the surface of a balloon where you drew dots on it and you blew it up, where you see the surface of the balloon expanding, but the size of all the dots are expanding too. Now, if that was really reality, we wouldn't know the universe is expanding because everything would still look the same. If everything around you, folks, suddenly expanded to 3 times its size, you wouldn't know because relatively it would all look the same to you. But the finite space or the finite matter, the material content, stays the same while the space that it occupies is expanding, just like a jar getting bigger and bigger, but with the same marbles inside and the same size. Now, here's what the problem is. Einstein demonstrated that space is a substantial field. It's a substantive field. This is why it can bend light. Space itself is a field, and that field has a geometry. So in this, in this idea of an expanding universe with dark energy, there's an elephant in the room, Adnan. And the elephant is, where is the extra spatial field coming from? Because the spatial field occupies all of the universe. So if the universe is expanding but the geometry is not. If the geometry was expanding, Adnan, with the universe, we would have that scenario with the surface of the balloon, where everything would get bigger at the same time. You wouldn't even know it was expanding. But space is expanding while the material content is staying the same. So where does all the additional spatial field come from? Since we know the spatial field was part of the Big Bang, the bubble of space-time, the continuous spatial field was created and expanded with the early universe. Well, where does the extra spatial field comes from? You guys will love this. Physics says, well, it just appears. I swear, this is what they say. It just appears, just comes into being. I swear. That's the official storyline. Of course, you won't hear that publicly. That's behind closed doors, it's just like these, church scandals where they find that the leader of the church is a pedophile or something. Everybody hides it. They don't want anybody to know that. It would be disastrous for business. But supergeometric theory says that the quantum singularity still exists and the universe is continuously emerging from it, which would not only explain the expansion of the universe without the need for dark energy, imaginary stuff, but would also explain where the additional measure of the spatial field is coming from. That's good stuff.
So, Thomas, so in other words, are you saying that is there basically, was this out information? Because I'm not into that all the time or reading it all the time, obviously. But is this information out that explained it in that way that, hey, space is expanding, everything within is still staying the same? Or is there some
Yeah.
kind of, do you have to go to these dark corners to find it, and it's not something that's generally talked about,
Well, you have to do the research,
right? But
you
it's
know.
there if you are looking for it.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
And the idea that space is expanding, but the geometry of space-time is staying the same,
Sorry,
but
clicked
the
the wrong button.
spatial field is expanding. It's almost like if you had a fabric that had a particular weave and a particular size, okay, cross stitch, whatever it is. I don't understand fabrics all that much other than the basic idea that they're a weave of threads. And if you could imagine that piece of cloth magically getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but that the weaves of the fabric aren't expanding. Let's say you have a like a flower or any kind of figure embroidered into the fabric, into the weave of the fabric. The edges of the fabric are getting bigger and bigger, but the weave or the embroidery is not getting bigger. That's staying the same. It's just that the fabric is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. That's universal expansion. Now, I've said it in an oversimplified way, but uh, that's basically the idea. Yes. And expansion of the universe, you can read that anywhere. You can go look it up. If you want to look up dark energy, you can look that up. It's all public information. You may have to dig a little bit to get into the more esoteric stuff.
Right. There was one question came in from the 5D Raven. It
All
says,
right. I like
"Is
that.
so is it found in mainstream science?" And it says, "You mean?" So in other words, you basically answered the question I had. It is found in mainstream science if you do the
Oh, yeah.
research.
Yeah. When I'm talking about the expansion of the universe, this is mainstream physics. It's one of the big puzzles of astrophysics is why is the universe expanding? What's causing it? Um, and the objects in the universe are staying the same size, but they are spreading out further apart from each other as the space time that they occupy expands. It's a little esoteric because what we're talking about we don't encounter this in everyday life. The things that we're familiar with in day to day life don't behave like this. So you really have to look it up and research and read about it and try to understand what's being talked about. The principles are not that difficult. It's just that they're so uncommon that they're counterintuitive. They're contrary to the way we normally think about things. Uh, just like Einstein's relativity, where he demonstrated that a clock at the equator runs at a different speed than the exact same clock running at the North Pole because of the velocity that it's traveling at around you know, the equator of the Earth instead of being almost stationary at the North Pole. That's counterintuitive. Um, or where he talked about his mental experiments at the uh, in a transparent train boxcar traveling right under the speed of light, and a person inside the boxcar lights a candle and immediately sees the light on the opposite wall. Whereas the observer, not traveling at the speed of light, looking inside the train, can see that the light beam has not yet struck the opposite wall inside the car, but the person inside the car sees it as having already struck the wall. Crazy. Counterintuitive. You have to research it and study it. You have to be a student of it.
So Thomas, so Crypto Mojito, thank you very much for your super chat. I appreciate it. There was a red pill doc. I don't know that this is necessarily a question or a statement. I don't know. You might understand this differently. I know as always, if you don't understand it, I'm asking Red Pill Doc to rephrase it. But
Sure.
this is different from what was originally asked. He said, was thinking about Carl Jung's interest in UFOs. Do we
Ah,
awaken into another realm and interpret as one a mystical experience of that mindset versus a UFO abduction if less inclined to understand it? Does that make sense to you?
Adnan, do you understand the question?
Not quite. I mean, it has. I'm sorry, Red Pill. If you can phrase it just simply and straightforward, I'm not quite sure what you are trying
The
to
the
say by
the
that.
listener the listener is the listener is taking a train of thought and forming sequential conclusions or questions and trying to condense all those sequential questions into one question. And
I'm sure
that's what the
he'll if
challenge
there's if you can make it simplified or just get to a simpler point, because sometimes it is difficult to expound on another idea.
Oh, these
You know,
things are awful. They're just awful to try to figure out what's going on. And people trust me, Adnan, from my experience, this person here is asking a question. They know exactly what they're thinking. They know exactly what they're trying to ask, but to try to put it into words and to try to follow it in a, in a logical sequence to be able to express it,
right,
uh, it's awful. It's just awful because we don't have the common terminology for these things, and we're talking about concepts uh, that creative people imagine, but that these imaginations go beyond the common culture. They're thinking of things beyond, getting up and brushing your teeth and going to work and kissing your wife and all. You know what I
right,
mean?
right.
So, how do they express that in normal language? You remember in my yeah, in my synopsis there, where I talked about it took me almost 30 years of research, 3 decades of research to write this book. A lot of that research, Adnan, had to be about taking the concepts that I was imagining it and reducing it into human language and a meaningful standardized terminology. And these poor people trying to ask the questions. They know what they're trying to ask. This red pill person, they know exactly what they're trying to ask. But how do you crystallize it? How do you formulate the question? How do you verbalize it in a way that another person would understand? Because oftentimes, Adnan, these creative imaginations are very personal.
Right.
That
Well,
they
you know, I
think
think
about
part of that,
themselves.
right. Well, I mean, very simple way, and I haven't confirmed this information. I just read it. I didn't really look up to see whether or not it's true, but it was talking about, during Shakespearean times that Shakespeare himself basically used vocabulary of like 50,000 words, whereas in we are normal, American English, it's only about 3,000.
Uh-huh.
And
Amen.
so that's quite a huge compression of words that can explain certain things. For example, like some languages have certain words that America doesn't have. Now, of course, Americans always just take it. Like, for example, there is no, as far as I know, I mean, I've been here for 20 years, but for example, there's no English word for Schadenfreude, which
Okay.
basically, which means if somebody, it's basically when it could be someone you don't like or something bad happens to them, and you go, ha ha ha, you get what you deserve, But right, but
Ah,
right, but we have these words, and all. Well, German has just one word, and
yeah,
so anyway, and that's just a limitation, obviously, from language to language and the way it's expressed. But never
yeah,
mind having such a cut out or compressed vocabulary to we don't use these colorful words
that's
anymore
right.
to describe things anymore.
And on top of that, uh, um, people are trying to explain or trying to express things that have been private uh, visualizations, private fantasies, private
Right.
imaginations as they play through something logical in their mind and trying to determine something esoteric. This person knows exactly what they're trying to ask us, Adnan. They just don't know how to express it because we don't.
Yeah.
It's
I'm
like you were
waiting.
talking
I've
about.
did ask him to rewrite some of the questions, but it hasn't come through. So
Mhm.
we'll see if he will. If not,
It's
but
hard.
I do.
It's
Of
just
course,
like when you.
everyone watching, I always would like for their questions to be answered in one form or another. And if someone doesn't know, at least then they get the answer of, "Thank, great question, but I don't know." But if we
Yeah.
can't figure out exactly what is meant by the question, it's hard to answer it.
Oh yeah. You can't. We can only do so much. Uh, we can help if we can, but that's why I said I know that it's a train of personal visualizing
Hmm.
where they've started at a certain point and they've taken that to where they can in their own imagination to another point, but they're asking all the intermediate steps in one question when it really should be five or six different questions. So and we're not used to. It's like what you mentioned, that German word. The only
Right.
reason why it's used is because it's shared by the culture. Everybody knows what it means.
Right. Right.
Imagine
So
trying to describe that to somebody in one word and nobody's used the word before. If you said that, they would say that's Meshuggah.
right. So I don't know. It's a Red Pill Doc explain just a little bit more. It says, "Yes, thank you, Thomas. I had an experience that I classify as a mystical experience, but I might have felt like an abduction if not aware of study of mysticism. Where is that space I visited?"
Oh, I think I understand what he's saying.
Right.
Yeah, but it depends on if he's asking whether that's much clearer. Thank you. Whether the space that he visited is internal or was it externalized? Like he was actually in a different world or something physically and not internal. In other words, I can imagine many internal spaces in my head. And it almost sounds like whether he wants to know whether it was imaginary or real,
Right.
and whether my theories would,
Help explain it.
yeah, or at least address whether it's real or not.
Right.
Well, here's the problem. Here's the first problem with this. Not actually a problem, but this would be helpful maybe. All thoughts are contained within the human brain. The human brain is a physical object. It's a physical mechanism. And it conveys and holds and imagines these thoughts in electrochemical formation. So here's another thing about my theory, Adnan, is that everything that you imagine, or like I said, everything that you image is real. If it wasn't real, then the brain wouldn't be real. But the brain is real. It's built according to physical principles governing the universe. which means that anything that's contained within it has to be consistent with the laws and principles that govern the construction of that brain. That's a revolutionary concept too.
Right.
That's another earth-shattering, barrier-breaking idea. But it's very simple. It's almost childlike in its logic. So anything that you image in your brain is real because it's in your brain. If it was inconsistent with the structure of your brain, you could not imagine it. You see what I
Mm.
mean?
Right, right.
And that's just simple, almost childlike logic. Why they haven't applied it? Well, that's because what I'm doing is blurring the lines between disciplines, like between psychology, parapsychology, and physics. A physicist doesn't think he needs to study psychology. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Isn't physics the study of everything physical? And isn't the human brain physical? See, they take those outs, Adnan. They take those. We'll excuse ourselves from the room because psychology isn't physics. Horse hockey.
Mm.
Psychology is contained within the human brain, which is a physical object and operates according to physical principles. They cop out, man. Of course, it's hard. It's hard to cross discipline in your knowledge.
So, Thomas, I don't know what else to ask you, to be honest, and I don't know if you want to go into more things. There've been, steady number of people watching, and there those that wanted to ask questions have asked them. What are your thoughts? Do you want to keep going a little bit more, or do you
Well,
want to
we
just
could. I
basically
mean,
conclude?
I think I mentioned to you that in our initial communications about this interview
Mm-hmm.
is that I can go for hours, man, because the subject is limitless.
Right, right.
You
Well, I
know,
mean, I would. That's why I would hate to um, rob people from, you know, basically being able to hear more of what you have to say. The only limitation that I'm having is me.
oh, I hear you, man.
It's been a long day for me, but I would
The
hate to be
spirit is willing,
the
but the
limiter.
body is weak.
Right, right. And it's
Yeah,
not helping me. I'm starting a more of a healthy approach on eating and getting back to exercising so I can actually get my butt to stay awake longer.
well, there you go. Well,
Right.
I mean, you're the host, Adnan, and this is your
Well,
show.
how about then, I really, of course this won't be the last time, that I would like you to come on, and if you're willing, you're more than welcome, sometime in the future. But
Sure.
this will be an opportunity to send people in the description box below this video. There's Thomas's website, access to Amazon, to where you can get his books there, or Barnes and Noble. So check it out. That's why he put these thoughts together into a book so that it's available and it can be read on your own time, and hoping that you do check it out, because this if you yes what you've heard for the past 2.5 hours, it's very interesting, and it's different than the regular talk that we usually have on the UFO show that talks about metaphysical things and spiritual things, and using that kind of terminology, to where having Thomas describe it in more of this,
Yeah.
I want to call it down to earth science. Is that,
Yeah.
you
Well,
know?
Adnan, you brought up an important point right now, in that all these disciplines have their own set of terminology. And so people who are interested in spirituality, they have their own set of terminology. People who are interested in physics, science, have their own set of terminology. Paranormal investigators have their own set of terminology. Ufology does, and they're all different. Um, one of the things is supergeometry, the theory tries to find a solution for, is to provide this common set of principles and a common set of terminology so that the lines between those disciplines are blurred to where you can crosstalk, so to speak, very easily. You heard me talk about ghosts. You've heard me talk about gravity with the same principles. You've heard me talk about the beginning of the universe. All these different things using the same concept, same set of terminology, like the example that I gave about volcanoes, earthquakes, and mountain formation. Instead of three separate things with their own terminology, the theory of plate tectonics has brought them all together under one roof with a common set of concepts and terminology. And that's what's lacking. It's just like, well, I was talking about where the UFO that interferes with the operation of electrical equipment. Nobody thinks the UFO is drawing energy from your car battery to manifest. But in paranormal phenomena, when the same thing happens in the presence of disruptive electromagnetic fields, they think the spirit is drawing energy from your camera so it can manifest. But it's the same phenomena. You see what I mean?
Yes, I do.
Completely different thinking, completely terminology.
Right.
And the guy who's talking about the ghost will say, well, you're talking about UFOs. That's something completely different,
Right.
you know,
Right.
when in fact it's the identical flipping thing. Um, you know, so
Well, yeah, I
it's
don't
like,
know that that's going to change anytime soon, to be
no,
honest. But if you are a person out there that says I'm open-minded, you're going to try to draw these connections and kind of make it work for you, and not to be limited by one field or another, or one terminology or another.
yeah.
But
But then, Adnan, you have to communicate it to others. This is what makes it extremely difficult because it's like what we've done in this interview. There have been a number of concepts where I've had to take time to explain all the background until listeners can follow me to know what I'm leading up to and what I'm about to say. Because if I said it up front, they think I'd be talking Martian.
right.
So I have to actually share with others what my background thoughts are and what the science is to bring them up to a point where they can actually understand that I'm saying something other than just gibberish.
Right. Well, I hope that uh, I basically was quiet enough for you to keep talking and not be too disrupted. That's how I usually like to talk to people, because eventually they will come around and give me the answers I'm looking for instead of constantly to interrupt. So I hope this was satisfactory for you.
Oh, yeah, it's great. As a host, it must, I feel it's great if your guest does all the heavy lifting.
Right, right. Well, especially when you start throwing those terms at me that I haven't really researched in a great deal, trying to not have too many stupid questions.
No, yeah, well, and then the opposite occurs when, and you may have had them, where you get those, bump on a log guests, where you ask them a question and they go, yeah.
Oh, right. No,
And that's it.
that's definitely not you. Okay. So anyway, Thomas, thank you very much, and everyone, please check out Thomas's website. Again, it's in the description box below. And do you have any contact info on your site so that if somebody does have a question, maybe they could reach out to you or
Yeah, there is an email on my website,
There you go. So please do. If
cosmail.com.
if there's any follow-up questions that you guys might have, reach out to Thomas. I'm sure he would get to you when he has time. So
Mhm.
again, thank you very much. I'm glad we did this, and so just I'm glad we finally reconnected. Like I said, it's been six years, and I
Oh,
know I
yeah.
talked to you
Thanks.
once, maybe 3 years ago, and I can't
I know.
believe it's been that long.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Anytime.
And thanks, folks, for putting up with me.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching. I appreciate it. Check out Thomas's website. I'm glad you were able to join us for this Friday night. And stay tuned. Next week, I should have some more webcasts coming out. And then another Friday, 7 p.m. show Central Time. So thank you very much for joining. Have a good day and take care.